Hello and welcome to the very first tutorial on maxwellzone.com, hopefully the first of many. So for this tutorial I'm going to show you how to render light trails more efficiently. And first I want to show you what the problem is. So here I have an emitter that's moving from frame 0 to 24. And I've set the playback to be 24 frames per second, so this represents 1 second of movement. And then to get the motion blur, all you have to do really is go into the Maxwell camera parameters and set your shutter speed to 1, which means a shutter speed of 1 second. So if you want a shutter speed of 2 seconds, you would just put this to 0.5. If you want it to be 4 seconds, 0.25, and so on. And then of course in the render options, all you have to do is turn on the motion blur here. And you also have motion plus deformation, and this means if your mesh is actually deforming, so if you have these vertices that are moving, for example, if you have an animated character and you want accurate 3D motion blur, in that case you should use motion plus deformation. But in this case, since the entire object is moving, we only need motion type, and that's going to render a bit faster than motion plus deformation. And also the motion blur steps, in this case, since we have a linear movement, it's not moving across a curve, you only need really 2 motion blur steps, and that's going to give you the fastest possible rendering with the smallest motion blur steps. So if I render this, and by the way, this is just an emitter surface with a regular emitter material applied to it. Okay, so nothing special there. So render this. Okay, and you can see right away the problem here. The thing is that the illumination itself that's coming from the emitter, that's actually rendering pretty fast. You can see that even by maybe sampling level 11, the lighting itself is going to be completely clean, whereas the emitter surface itself is still very noisy. So Maxwell has trouble, rendering clean that emitter surface itself. And the thing is that the smaller this emitter surface is compared to your render, so if I make this a lot smaller and render again, the more difficult it's going to be for Maxwell to sample that area. So you can see here that we're almost not even getting any hint of existence of that emitter there, of that emitter trail. But again, the lighting itself is still the same speed as this one. Okay, so that gave me the idea, well, what can we do to not display the trail directly, but sort of make it appear anyway. So the idea is then basically that you hide the emitter surface itself, and instead you use the emitter. So here's the emitter, and it's pointing towards this surface, which is just a regular diffuse surface, or basically it can be anything. But so we're using an emitter to light a surface, and we're gonna hide the emitter to camera. So basically you just check here hide to camera for this emitter mesh, and the only thing that's going to be visible is the indirect or the lit area there. That's not an emitter. So if I render that instead, you can see now a huge difference in speed. Okay, so you can see that this area here that's lit by that emitter is going to be clean maybe at the same speed as the rest of the scene, basically. So by sampling level 11 or 12, it's going to be completely clean, whereas the trail from this emitter is going to take a lot longer to clean. And again, the difference is even more dramatic if you have small light trails in your render. So again, it doesn't matter what the real scale of the emitter is, it matters its scale compared to how big your render is. So that's going to make it slower to render. You can see here that this one is basically almost clean and this one is just starting to appear. So it's a huge difference between the two. Okay. So what else could we do with this emitter trick here? Could we use, for example, thin subsurface scattering and have the emitter light through the surface instead? And that actually works pretty well also. So just show you that. Oops. Just hide this one. And these ones. So the thing is, with that indirect method with the emitter and the diffuse surface, you have not so good control when you want to do light trails, for example. You don't have so much control over the fall off of the look. I mean, you could use a layer mask, a feathered layer mask if you wanted to, but you could also bring it closer to how it works in the real world, and I always prefer that if it's fast enough to render, that is. And in this case it works pretty well. So here I have the emitter again, and this time it's pointing towards this surface here, which has a pretty standard thin subsurface scattering material applied to it. Let me just show you that quickly. So it's not a multi-layer material, it's very simple, it's just one BSDF, and it just basically is a red transparent material with a pretty low attenuation, because I want it to be, you know, attenuated a lot faster. I want it to actually look red. If I set this too high, then the transmittance color isn't going to have time to attenuate, so it's going to look whiter. That's why I have a low attenuation. And then in the subsurface scattering, in the subsurface properties, I just turn on the coefficient, and then I set the asymmetry to negative so that more of the light passes through the object. So I'm not going to go through these parameters in detail now because it's out of the scope of this tutorial, but as a basic rule, keep in mind that if you have negative asymmetry, then you're telling Maxwell that you want most of the light that's coming from this emitter to continue to pass through the object with negative asymmetry. So you have a forward scattering with negative asymmetry. And if you set it to positive asymmetry, then more of the light is going to bounce back towards your light source. So you have a back scattering, subsurface scattering in that case. So for our case, we want negative because we want most of the light to pass through this red object here. Let me see if I can use fire quickly to show you. Okay, so you can see there's quite a bit of light that's going through this object, and if I set it to positive, then you can see that there's much less light and much more light that's falling back towards the light source. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind with the thin subsurface scattering. It's usually the asymmetry setting. And then for the thickness value, so here I'm specifying a virtual thickness. If I set it too thin, you can see that again my light source is turning white because it doesn't have time to attenuate, because I'm specifying that this plane is just about 1 millimeter thick. So the scale is in millimeters. So I just want to make it a bit thicker, sorry, so that I get a nice red tail light example here, sort of like that. So that's a little bit about the setting, but getting back to rendering the light trail. So again, this is just animated over the course of almost 1 second. And if I render that, okay, so you can see that even within subsurface scattering, this trail is rendering pretty fast. So again, the emitter itself, it's hidden to camera, just to make sure that it doesn't show up in the render from any angle. And it's just this surface here that's visible to the camera. And you can see that, again, even by sampling level 11 or 12, it's going to be pretty clean, even the illumination and the trail itself. And I prefer this look a little bit more because it makes a nice softer fall off even without any scattering applied. You can see it looks almost like a lightsaber, which is nice, and with scattering it looks, of course, even better. So like that. Okay, so that's a nice way to do pretty accurate and close to how taillights work in the real world. And if you want to avoid this spill of light, all you have to do really is construct a small box here around this emitter so that you don't get any light spill from the sides of this emitter. That's all you have to do, and it doesn't actually slow down the render that much. Okay, so that's light trails within SSS. Going to stop that. And finally, how can we do light trails that actually change the color as they move along with the motion blur? And the problem here is that it might not be obvious at first, but the thing is that you can animate the color parameter of your emitter so that it changes color with time for every frame of your animation, right? So for every frame, if I export, say, an animation of 24 frames, so I get 24 MXS files, then each of those files is going to have a slightly different, let's say I'm changing it from white to red. Each MXS file is going to have a slightly different key here of those 24 MXS files. But the thing is that here we're only dealing with one MXS file for these light trails, including this one. This is just one MXS file with a very long exposure set in the camera. So in that case, we only have one parameter in the MXS file. It can't change multiple times in the same MXS. So one way I thought of solving that, I'm going to show you here the setup. For this scene, and actually if I just render this quickly. Oops. Yep. The problem here is that I forgot to also change the number of motion blur steps. So even though these emitters are animated along these curves, since we only have 2 motion blur steps, it's only going to take into account the first and the last positions. So that's why you saw that straight line. So whenever you're dealing with curves and motion blur or movement that's not completely linear, you have to increase the motion blur steps until those look fine. So in this case, maybe I'm going to set it to well, let's set it to 24 or 20, so that it's about 1 sample or step per frame approximately. But you'll see that maybe that's not enough because I also have them spinning around, so maybe that's not enough. But let's see how this renders. Okay, so you can see I get these light trails that change their colors like that from one MXS. So what's the setup for this scene then? ones. So again, first of all, the same principle applies. These are the emitters and they're hidden from camera, so the only thing that's visible in the render is this cylinder here that just has, again, a very simple diffuse white material applied to it. And that's actually what we're seeing in the scene. And let me just turn off the animation for this. And the constraint. So what's happening here is that I have these three emitter surfaces, which in this case is I think it's just green, red, and blue, but of course they can be any color emitter you want. And I have them parented to this null, and this null is set to spin around just like that. Okay, and then this null is in its turn parented to this cylinder here. Okay, so when I animate the cylinder, just set back the animation for the cylinder. Okay, you can see that the emitters follow along the cylinder at the same time they're rotating around about their own axis there. And just turn on the constraint again. And then I have the cylinder constrained along a path, so it's following that path. Okay, and again, that works pretty well. I mean, you can see in this case that I'm getting very nicely smooth transitions of color, and the thing is, they may look a little bit weird here, for example these areas here, but that's just because I think I didn't have enough motion blur steps, because the emitters are spinning so fast. I don't think 20 steps is enough, so let me change that to something maybe 40. And just keep in mind that as you increase the motion blur steps, yes, the render is going to take longer, but it's not, you know, astronomically longer. For the sake of keeping things efficient, don't suddenly go changing it to 400 or something like that. Just increase it slowly until the render looks like you want. And again, this doesn't necessarily look wrong. Maybe you prefer this more psychedelic look. Let me just render this one. So I think I set it to 40, so you can see the difference. Oops. Let me just set the camera correctly. And you'll see that this render is going to have a much smoother look in the transitions, much more logical transition in this case compared to this one. And again, you can see that it renders pretty fast. Even the illumination around the chair and on the floor and the light trail itself, by sample level 15 or so, I think it would look pretty much clean. And I'm not using a very fast computer. It's not a dual Xeon or anything like that. It's actually a 4 or 5 year old i7, 2600 i7 I'm using. And so there you can see the difference. Also the trail itself is smoother. You can see especially here compared to this trail here. And the transitions of the colors are much smoother as well. So again, it's not right or wrong, it just depends on the look you're after. And it's not much slower. I mean, going by the benchmark, this one has 435, this one has 400, 408. So, you know, we doubled the steps, but it's not a huge difference. It's by no means twice as slow. Right, so that's how you can do multicolored light trails from just a single MXS. And finally, I wanted to show you, just as a bonus, so to speak, again with the thin SSS, so how you can do neon signs. And I mean, this is not the perfect solution for all cases, but in many cases maybe you don't necessarily need to see the glass tubes and stuff like that. You just want to see the illumination of the neon sign, and in this case it actually works pretty well just by animating a bunch of spheres, which again have the exact same thin SSS material, the red SSS material applied to them, and they're animated across a path. And inside the spheres there's a little emitter sphere, and that's it basically. And I just needed to model the curves. I didn't need to model anything else to create the sign. You can see if I render this, let's see if the steps are enough. Yeah, it looks like it's enough. So you can see that it actually renders pretty nicely for a neon sign. I mean, this could work very well in many cases, and it's very fast and simple to set up. There's very little modeling involved. And you can see again that it renders pretty quickly, even though we have 40 motion blur steps and thin SSS, and this box I think has a rough metallic material applied to it. And of course with scattering this is going to look a lot cooler, for example like that. And of course, since these emitters are separate, you can animate them using multi-light. So you can do like a cool flickering bar sign. And again, this will probably render pretty much noiseless by sample level 12, 13, something like that. So yeah, that's just one cool way you can do neon signs with motion blur and thin SSS, because again with the thin SSS you get these nice soft fall-offs here, just like real gas tubes in neon signs. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Bye.